How do we survive grief? That's the topic we're going to be addressing today on Flourish-Meant. I'm your host, Tina Yeager. Today, I have a special guest with me, and her name is Jenny Leavitt. She's a pastor's wife, an award-winning author, a speaker, and a coach. And she has a mission to help others find the hope and healing and happiness that she was able to find even after losing her 17-year-old son to a drunk driver in 2015. Welcome, Jenny. I am so happy that you're here. I'm grateful that you're willing to address this very important topic today.
Thank you so much, Tina. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
So let's dive in, if you don't mind, into why you became the unwilling expert on grief and what your heart is for sharing with others about this very important, much needed message.
Well, my husband and I had been in ministry leadership roles for almost 3 decades when that accident happened that you mentioned. And our two sons were in the vehicle, and Jacob, our 17-year-old son, died there at the accident scene. Then our older son, Caleb, suffered catastrophic injuries and he almost died. It took about a year for him to recover. He is fully recovered. And in that time, even though we had been in ministry for decades at that point, we had such a hard time finding biblically sound resources during that time. And thank God that God did lead us to some. He led us to some wonderful mentors that unfortunately had been through what we'd been through, so they were able to walk that road with us. He led us to some wonderful counselors and grief groups that helped us and came alongside us. And we just want to be that to somebody else. The way people there comforted us and walked with us, we want to do the same for them.
So let's talk about what could be a good response to somebody initially when they're first hearing about this loss and they're first there. So, what would be a way that someone who is a support person, a community member, a church member can reach out that would actually be helpful? Because there are a lot of things that people do in the absence of the right resources that are not particularly helpful.
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's so true and so valid. My husband and I, and even Caleb, our son that survived, I think we all have, all three of us have illustrations of things people should not do or not say. Um, but one of the things that across the board, and not just our family, from other families that we've ministered to and walked alongside, one of the simplest things is just to be there. You don't have to say anything most of the time, just being there during that time. Because when we lost Jacob, we couldn't focus on that as much as we should have, could have, because Caleb was battling for his life as well. And we didn't know for a couple of weeks if he was even going to survive. He was in the trauma ICU unit and struggling for his own life. And I cannot tell you how wonderful it was to have a church family that rallied behind us. And most of them didn't know what to say, but they came and just sat with us in the ICU waiting room. Some of them brought meals, took care of things at our home because we weren't at home. And those kinds of things are the kinds of things that are just practical, simple things. You don't have to know what to say. As a matter of fact, you can even say, I don't know what to say. And they're going to understand that and they're going to appreciate that you're just being honest and you're not trying to throw out platitudes. You're not trying to fix something because it can't be fixed. At that point, they just need a friend. They just need somebody who will just say, I'm here. If you need anything, I'm here. And sometimes the grief is so overwhelming that they don't know what they need. So that's why, just like the act of bringing a meal to the hospital, it seems so simple, but when you're grieving, sometimes you forget to eat. So something so simple like that, just being there and thinking of what do they need that maybe they're just not thinking about, and just meeting that need.
So let's talk about the dilemma of needing people's support, but being raw and fresh in the grief and not even being motivated to reach out to get that support. What would you say to speak to that situation where there's a need that that person in need isn't going to ask for? How does that person grieving know what they need to do to get the support when they don't feel motivated?
That's a good question too. And there were lots of times when I had a couple of very good friends that they're still real good friends, because your friendships will change through something traumatic too. But the ones that are really close, hold on to those friends. And if they start encouraging you and speaking to you to maybe look into an area, really consider what they're saying, especially if they are coming from a biblical, trusted perspective that they have your best interest in mind. There were some of those friends that encouraged me to get help in areas that they saw that I needed help, but that they weren't in a capacity that they could get that help. And there were times that the people closest to me saw things that I wasn't seeing, um, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful that they had the courage to gently speak up and say, "Hey, I'm noticing this, and maybe you should get some help, or maybe this might be something that you could look into." I'm very grateful for that, and the spirit and the attitude in which it was delivered, and the timing. Sometimes it wasn't the best time, so they had to kind of wait for that. And I'm just very grateful for that.
So let's talk about the issue of loneliness in the middle of grief. There is a sense that, especially when you lose a child, even other people who have different forms of grief where they've lost other family members have a hard time really understanding how particularly tragic and heart-rending a child loss is. How did you get through that period of feeling so emotionally?
It's amazing that you bring that up, because on my website last year, I have a website with a newsletter. I sent out a survey last summer and asked, how can I help you? Like, what are some things that you're struggling with that I could speak to and maybe help you? Not that I've arrived by any stretch, but I'm on the journey. Some people have been on the journey longer than they have. How can I help you? Hands down, by far, the number one issue for my community was loneliness and isolation, and not, just feeling so disconnected. And I know some of that comes from us coming out of a worldwide pandemic, but a lot of the community that we work with, that is a real battle, and it can lead to depression. It can lead to all kinds of mental health crisis and issues. And so I started doing some research on how I could help them. And I didn't know this, that last May of 2023, the US Surgeon General actually declared it an epidemic of loneliness. And he said, right now, the detriment to our health is the equivalent of smoking a dozen cigarettes every day on our body. And so I have actually been working on small series of devotions that I'm going to be putting out on hope for the lonely heart, like how to recover from that and reconnect with that community and get away from that isolation, because it really is a real thing. When you're experiencing grief, you can feel like not only does nobody here, no human understand, but you can feel so disconnected from God. And like he is just distant. He doesn't care. All those assaults from the enemy start coming in your mind. Like, he just doesn't care. Nobody here cares. You just feel so isolated. And one of the most simple things that I can share in the few minutes that we have here is to not forsake just the basic disciplines of your Christianity, those very basic things, prayer, even when you don't feel God, hear Him, see Him, reading your Bible. You know, there were days when I will tell you, I didn't read my Bible. I would let it play on my Bible app while I was doing my makeup, but I was still getting it inside my brain. Um, Going to church. I know it's hard. If you can, there's just something about actually physically being with other believers that will just those basic things. Um, Journaling, if you can, to help process some of those things, but just hold on to those basic Christian disciplines as much as you can, and those things will help you through those times of loneliness to get to the other side.
That's very helpful advice. And I do want to get into some more practical tips and counsel for those who are suffering grief and those who are supporting people going through grief right now. But for now, would you share how people can get in touch with you and stay connected with you online and get a copy of your book? And be sure to give us the title as well.
Sure. The name of my book is God Prints Finding Evidence of God in the Shattered Pieces of Life. And it is our family story of the accident, but also some other things that we went through and how we found God faithful through it all. And the best way for people to stay connected with me is if they go directly to my website. All of my social media links are on there. The link to our family's YouTube channel that we just started in November is on there. And that's my name, www.jennyleavitt.com, and they can sign up for my newsletter as well. And there they can also get a free study guide that goes with the book on the website as well.
In this second half of our conversation with Jenny Leavitt, we're going to dive into some practical things about what you can do to survive grief and how you can help others in your community, in your family, in your neighborhoods that are suffering with grief. Jenny, what is the first thing that someone who's suffering from grief needs to be prepared to do as response that would be a good self-care response in that situation?
That's a great question, Tina. So, one of the very first things that I encourage people is to maybe rethink how you think about getting help if you need it. Sometimes it's really difficult for I think part of it is our Western civilization mindset about being independent and that we can do this on our own. And some things we can, but grief is a whole nother beast that unfortunately I think our Western culture, we don't give it enough space to process it in a healthy way. You know, when the accident happened and I lost Jacob, um, I think the bereavement days at my job was 3, and my husband's was 1. Like, how on earth are you supposed to process the loss of your 17-year-old child and go back to work and function in that time? Now, thankfully, I had a lot of coworkers that rallied around me and they donated sick days so I could take off. But my husband had to use past his bereavement day, he had to use his personal days, and then he still had to go back to work after 2 weeks. We have a son in the ICU unit, and we're trying to figure out how to bury another son. So just allowing yourself the space that you need to process and realizing I may need help beyond me. Whatever that looks like for you, if that looks like one-on-one therapy, if that looks like joining grief support groups, whatever that looks like, allowing that space and recognizing that you're going to need it. You can't just shove it under the rug. It's not going to go away. You're going to have to learn how to process it. And a lot of times that means that you need somebody that's on the outside that can look in with a fresh perspective and help you.
So they can't join the grief share groups immediately. It does take a little time before you're ready for that. But what can you do at first? Can you text a friend and simply say, please pray for our family? Don't post this on social media. Now you can post it on social media, kind of wading slowly into when you're ready to receive all of that feedback. What does that process look like with getting the right circles of community that you're able to respond to? Because you are going to get with the broader community a lot of people responding with things that aren't helpful.
That's very true. And I'm thinking back to after our accident, and that's just something that kind of naturally was put into place because I had those couple of friends that one of them is, I kind of joke around that she's got that mama bear where if like we were at church, for instance, I knew that she could kind of be my buffer to help me with those things. I was so overwhelmed with grief that it was nice to have some people that I knew they could help me with those kinds of practical things of standing in the gap and kind of helping with it. If I texted and said, hey, can you just, have these couple of people that I know are trusted just be praying for me? Today's a really hard day. But having those couple of people that I just knew they weren't going to gossip, they weren't going to just put it all out there on social media, but they would pray and they would rally with me. Absolutely. And there were times that even then I would almost vet what I said to them, what I felt comfortable sharing with them, or things that I only felt comfortable sharing with my husband, Myron, and asking him to pray for me. So definitely early on, just be careful, I guess, who you share with and what you share with. And if you don't have anybody, because sometimes that happens, I would encourage you to pray and ask God to lead you to somebody that you can trust initially. Um, so that because we need that connection, we need that community. Um, Whether it's only one person, we still need that.
And if the only people you're relying on are the people that are also affected by grief, that gets very complicated. How
Mhm.
did you how did you manage the friction that can sometimes happen in a marriage when you have lost a child? How did you really learn how to work through that and keep your marriage intact throughout that process? Because that can be extremely trying on a marriage at in any loss, but especially the loss of a child.
Yes, unfortunately, my husband and I had been in ministry so long, we knew the statistics on marriages and the loss of children. As a matter of fact, just 3 months before we lost Jacob, a 7-year-old girl in our church lost the battle to brain cancer, and we had been walking with her parents through that whole process leading up to her death. And my husband was even there when she went to be with Jesus. So, like, we knew from the get go, right after the accident, we actually had a very open conversation. And my husband knew right off the bat and said, we're going to have to fight. If this marriage is going to survive, we're going to have to fight through the tension and everything that's going to happen. And, we're almost 9 years out, and it's gotten a lot better, but I don't want anybody to feel like it's just been a walk in the park. We really have had to fight through, get help when we had to get help, be willing to just be open with each other. And probably one of the best things that I try to encourage people is to be gracious with each other. I mean, really, this goes with anybody who's grieving, but marriages especially, because men and women grieve differently, personalities grieve differently. How I think he may be feeling is not how he's feeling. Just because I'm feeling that way, I can't project that on him and think that he's feeling that way or understanding that way. But being vulnerable and being willing to say, this is what I'm battling right now, this is what I'm going through. And then when your spouse actually opens up and says that, don't say the first thing that comes to your mind because it's probably judgmental, or it could come across judgmental because they're thinking, well, I just shared my whole heart with you. So, just sometimes just listen and be that safe place for your spouse where they know we're in this together. We're going to get through this. God is going to help us, and we're going to do this together.
So you have to make that an intentional priority to protect and preserve your marriage, no matter what either of you is feeling at any moment, just making sure you put Jesus in the middle of that and make it a
Yes.
priority to protect that at all costs. There's a
Yep.
lot of things that we could get into here on grief, and I really want you to get me just one last main thing that you want to make sure the audience hears about surviving grief.
Is that you have to set your will that as a believer, it doesn't matter if I can see God, feel God, hear God at that moment. His promises in scripture are still the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never changes. Our feelings may go up and down, they may be wishy washy, but his promises don't change. So just keep doing the next right thing one step at a time. That's all it takes. And then the next 6 months from now, you'll be able to look back and say, all right, I have gotten better. It may not be the progress I wanted, but I'm getting better one step at a time.
Thank you so much, Jenny. That's been really, really helpful. And I know that people have more questions about how to survive grief, and we can't fit that all into 20 minutes, but you do have more resources to offer on your website and in your book. So, can you leave the audience with how to stay connected with you and get a copy of that book?
Sure. Again, the best way is to go to my website that has the links to everything that I have out there. And so the book is God Prince Finding Evidence of God in the Shattered Pieces of Life. There are links to purchase that on the website, but it is available everywhere books are sold. The audiobook is also available as well. There's a free study guide on my website. The new edition is the YouTube channel, which the link is on my website as well. On that, so far, Caleb and I talk a lot about common questions that we get, sibling grief, dealing with the aftermath, and how we work through guilt and anger and all those kinds of things. In the future, I hope to have interviews with experts like you, Tina, who can share, from a clinical standpoint, maybe some practical things. There's going to be lots of things. I just really want it to be a good resource for people that need it. So jennyleavitt.com.
I hope that all of you listening were inspired and encouraged by this conversation. And I do hope that if you or someone that you know and care about is struggling with grief, that you will go and access the resources that Jenny mentioned here. There are so many things that you will really have need of support for in that process and journey. And remember, it's not the same for anyone. We are just here in this journey together, supporting you where you are uniquely in your grief. And of course, I also hope that you will hit subscribe and come back for the next episode of Flourishment.